It seems like all anybody wants today is more, bigger, shinier. But over the past few years, I've realized that all I've ever really wanted is some land in the middle of nowhere and a small cabin on the water where I can spend my free time. So in this video, I'm making that dream a reality and building the first structure on my 40 acres of Muskoka wilderness. A tiny, off-grid cottage in the woods that emphasizes the nature around it. Spring has finally come in 2025, and now I can get back up to my Muskoka getaway. I bought this land about a year ago, and now I'm finally ready to start building my first structure. So this project begins scouting for a building site. I had an idea of where I wanted the structure to go, and I used a shovel to dig around the area just to make sure there's no hidden surprises. With that all clear, I have some 2x4s that I'm cutting to length with a miter saw. And I'm basically just making a rectangle template the same size as what the building footprint's gonna be. I screwed this together, and then after I made sure it was square, I just put on a couple corner support pieces to hold this while I move it around. So now I can bring this over to my building site and use this as a visual representation of where the structure is going to be placed. And then I made some little adjustments to get its orientation just about right. And now I can start mapping out my footings. So there's going to be 6 footings that support this bunkie that are tapped down into the bedrock just below the soil. So I measured out my footing placements on the 2x4s, and then I'm going to be using some string to make some straight lines between each of these points. Where these strings intersect is going to mark out exactly where a footing needs to be dug, so I marked this out with some bright orange line paint so that I can remove the template and start digging. So this area of Ontario is pretty much all granite bedrock. Where I'm digging these footings, there's anywhere from a few inches to about a foot of soil and roots. So I dug through this with a shovel and used a reciprocating saw to get rid of any stubborn roots to get down to that solid bedrock foundation. I cleaned this off as well as I could, and then I'm going to be using this hammer drill with a 1/2-inch SDS bit to drill into this granite and set some rebar anchor points into here. So once I had a hole drilled 3 or 4 inches, I'd vacuum out any dust. And then I'm going to be putting a good glob of this Sika anchoring epoxy inside the hole. Next, I used an angle grinder to cut off a 8 or 10 inch section of this epoxy coated rebar and hammered that into the hole, and the anchoring epoxy should set that right into the stone. So for each of the 6 footings, I drilled in 3 of these rebar anchors. And then I put a concrete form tube over top of this, and this is ready for concrete. So I just used bagged concrete for this from my local hardware store and mixed this up with some water in a mixing tub until I had a slushy-like consistency. And then I can shovel that into each form till it's full. So I've never really done this before, but the idea here is that the concrete's giving us our compressive strength for the weight of the structure, and the rebar tapped into the rock should keep the concrete from sliding around. Next, I'm going to be adding one of these galvanized post holders. This is for 6x6 lumber. So I slid this into the concrete mixture and made sure it was level on both axes. And then once this concrete cures up, I'll be able to fasten some wood posts into these. And then I can cut those to length and make them all level with one another rather than trying to level each one of these concrete piers relative to each other. And after an afternoon of mixing up concrete, my back's about dead, and this is ready to move on in a couple days once that hardens up. So for the next step, I had to come back just before sunset, and then I have some of these pressure treated 6x6s, and I'm cutting off a section of these that I know is longer than the piece that I'm actually going to need. So to cut this, I'm using a circular saw, and I'd make a pass on all 4 sides of the board, and then complete that cut with a handsaw. So these pop right into the brackets I had set into the concrete. And then using a laser level, I'm going to mark a point on these and cut them all to be exactly level with each other. This is a lot easier if you do it right before dark when the laser level is nice and prominent. And I just marked the cut line on each, then took them over and cut them until I have all 6 posts sitting at the same height. The next day I used a long board and a level to double check that everything was indeed level. And then I nailed those posts into place using some big galvanized spiral nails. On top of the posts are going to be these beam brackets. So I nailed these into place as well, and then these are designed to hold 3 2x boards. So what I'm going to be doing is taking 3 2x6s and laminating these together using some framing nails. As well as one of these big lag screws every foot or so. This is basically going to make me a big beam that I can span the posts with and give me something to build my floor framing on top of. The final size of my bunkie is going to be 9 foot 8 by 11 feet, which gives me a square footage of 107 square feet. The reason I'm making it so small is because this is the maximum square footage you can go to in Ontario without a building permit, and that would come along with its whole own set of problems. The building would have to be set back 100 feet from the water. I'd have to add in electric and septic. The permits themselves would cost tens of thousands of dollars, and in the end it'd be probably minimum $400,000 for a modest sized cottage, whereas what I'm building I'm hoping to do for 50 or so. Also, the whole idea here is to be outside, not in a massive cottage, so I'm happy with this tiny shelter for now. So to start the floor, I'm using this cedar 2x6 lumber and cutting it to length with the miter saw. And then with my two end plates together, I'm marking out the spacing for the joists. I also mark this line on the inside face so that it's easier to line up the boards while I'm screwing them in. So with this cedar, I'm basically just making the outside rectangle of my floor. I also temporarily screwed on a couple scrap pieces to these side plates so that it's easier to screw the end plates on. To fasten this, I'm using a few 4-inch deck screws. And now I can start cutting all the joists. We're getting into about the middle of May here, and if you're wondering what the middle of May in Muskoka feels like, here's a window into it.
These bugs. God.
For this internal lumber, I'm just using pressure treated 2x6s because it's about a third of the price, and actually a little bit stronger than cedar. I want the cedar appearance boards on the outside though to match the deck and everything else. With all my joists installed, I added in a couple lines of blocking for some added strength and stability. And that's a finished floor framing. For floor insulation, I'm using some of these 2-inch rigid insulation panels, and I took these over to a friend's to have him help me cut these up, because using a table saw like this is a million times safer with 2 people. Now before I can install the insulation, a couple more things. I need to tie this floor framing down to the foundation, so I'm using some of these hurricane straps and securing each joist to the beams. This is to stop the updraft, so when it gets really windy and there's a building on top of here, the wind won't push this off the foundation. I also used some of these truss screws. I wasn't sure which of these would work better, so I used a combination of both. Next, I added a few cross braces from the bottom of each post up to the top of the beam for a little bit of lateral support. And then I added in some of this lumber underneath the framing, which is going to give me a bit of surface area at the ends of each one of these cells so that I can drop some plywood in here and keep this floor rodent free. Next, I drilled a couple weep holes in each one of these panels to let out any water that gets in here before there's a roof over this. And now onto the insulation. So I'm first going to start off with some of this Thermcoat spray insulation and just spray the perimeter of this sill. Then I hammered in one of these 2-inch sections of foam insulation. And then I'm going to do another coat of this Thermcoat, but do a light spray over the entire surface. Then I'll hammer in a second 2-inch panel until it's about flush with the floor framing. I have about 5 inches to fill, and I'm using 4 inches of rigid insulation. And then that Thermcoat should expand to fill in the extra 1-inch gap between the panels and give me a fully solid air-sealed floor insulation. This should have an R value of around R25. And now on to the subfloor. I'm using this 3/4 inch tongue and groove plywood and cutting it to size with one of these cheap track saw jigs and a normal circular saw. So before I put this plywood down, I'm going to use some of this subfloor construction adhesive. This should keep the floor from creaking and stop any of those cracks or moans or groans. The plywood can be set in place on top of this, and then once I made sure it's flush with the edges of the framing, I'm screwing this in with a bunch of 2-inch construction screws. With all the sheets down and tacked on, I had to go back and screw along every single one of these joists. Along the edges of a sheet, I'd put a screw every 6 inches, and down the middle about every 12. Even though this is a small floor, that still is about a half hour being bent over awkwardly like this. But that's the floor finished just in time to enjoy a perfect sunset. This is my favorite time of year. The fresh green leaves are abundant, the air is crisp and clear, and the sounds of nature finally return after a long winter. And now I can start framing my walls. I'm going to be using standard 2x4 lumber to frame this. The only difference is on the bottom plate of each wall I'm going to use this pressure treated lumber to be a little more water resistant, since this will be sitting right on the deck. With my top and bottom plate together, I'd mark out the placement for all my studs and then cut up as many studs as I needed. So to fasten this together, I'm using my battery-powered framing nailer and some 3¼ inch framing nails. I'm just shooting 3 nails into each stud through the top and bottom plate, and that throws these walls together pretty quickly. Framing is one of my favorite parts of the building process. One day I have nothing but a deck here, and within a day or two we'll have a standing structure here that really allows you to visualize what the end product is going to look like. This is probably the biggest step forward in the shortest amount of time of the entire build process, and it's satisfying to see. So for the headers over all of my windows, I'm using a couple pieces of 2x6 lumber. And then on my front wall, I'm going to have this massive 9-foot wide door. So for that header, I need something a lot stronger to span that distance, so I'm using some of these 11.5 inch LVLs. And these are propped up with 3 jack studs on each side to bear that load. And after a day of work, my walls are ready to be erected. So the next day, I had my brother make the 3-hour trip to come help me stand these up, because this is definitely not a one-man job. Before lifting the walls into place, I put a bead of expanding foam under the sill as an air seal, and we set the walls back a ½ inch from the edge of the deck to account for the plywood. And in about half an hour, we had a standing structure. I screwed the walls together using some 3-inch screws and screwed the walls down to the deck. I also added some of these big lag screws into the framing every few feet or so. We braced the structure onto the nearby trees to hold everything level until we get the sheeting on here. And a little bush hack if you do need to pull the walls one way is I'll use a ratchet strap at the bottom of one wall and the top of the other to pull the wall the direction I need until it's level, and then I'll screw on some cross bracing to hold that until it's sheeted. Lastly, I added on a double top plate, a dormer, and the gable ends. So for the sheeting, I'm using some 1/2-inch standard plywood and nailing this on with some 2 3/8-inch nails. These sheets take a lot of nails. I would do about every 6 inches along the edges of a sheet and 12 inches down the fields. And the reason it needs so many nails is because this is what's actually giving the structure its lateral support. All these nails keep the studs from moving or swaying in the wind, and ultimately keeps the whole structure square and level. With all the sheeting installed, I used a flush trim bit in my router to cut out the window openings. And now we're on to framing the roof. Starting off with the ridge beam, I have a couple of these 2x8s that I cut to length, I think around 13 feet, and I'm measuring out the spacing for each one of my rafters. To secure the rafters to the ridge beam, I'm going to be using some of these rafter strong ties. And I'm installing these on the ground because that's going to be a lot easier than climbing up and down on a ladder to install every single one of these and reach in awkward positions. So before I take this up, I have to install these brackets on each gable end that'll hold the 2 ridge beam boards. And now the boards can be lifted into place. To laminate the 2 boards into a beam, I'm using some more framing nails about every foot down the beam to make this act as one solid piece rather than 2 individual boards. So now I can start on the rafters. First off, I know the angle of my roof is 37 degrees, so I'm setting my miter saw to that and cutting one end off a 2x6. And now I have this 3D model printout of what the rafter measurements should be. So I marked my bird's mouth location onto a board and then used a speed square to complete these lines. With the speed square, I can easily pivot on these measurements to the angle of my roof or its inverse angle, and easily mark out that bird's mouth. Then I cut that out with a circular saw and finish the cut with the jigsaw. So after I took this up to the roof and made sure it's gonna fit, this is now gonna be the template for all my other rafters. I can just lay this on top of a fresh 2x6 and trace my cut lines and make as many repeatable rafters as I need to. So now with a bunch of those cut, I can start taking them up to the roof and tacking them into the brackets. The reason I only tack them on is because I still want to cut my overhang. I've found this is a lot easier to get consistent to just trace it off the wall once they're installed. So I have a board with my preferred overhang width, and I'm tracing this onto each rafter. Then I'm actually going to go up and take every rafter down and cut this cut line on the ground before doing the final install. You could cut this in the air, but it's honestly easier and quicker to just take them down and put them back up. Now I can install them permanently, and it also helps to number your boards when you're taking them down. That way when you're putting them back up, you know you're putting the same board in the same spot. These screw into those rafter brackets using 4 of those same strong tie screws. On the bottom end, I'll be using these truss screws, and these just go straight up through the double top plate into the rafter to form a structural connection. Simple as that. So now I have to install the fascia boards to complete the roof. So I first put up some of these brackets because I'm working alone, it's a lot easier to have stuff supported, and then lifted my fascia board into place. This is just a 2x8 that I ripped an angle off of with the table saw, and I had also pre-cut and measured this on the ground, so I just have to line it up with the rafters and screw it in. Now, if you're a real keen observer, you'll notice that there was an overhang left on these fascia boards, and that wasn't by accident. That's so that I can add some more rafters in here and complete the overhang over both ends of the roof. On the front, I decided to do this tapered, pointed roof style. It made it a bit more complicated, but I thought it'd add some character to this tiny structure. And now I can start filling in any of the framing I have left in the 2 gable ends. And the side walls of the dormer. And that's the framing fully completed. Lastly, I have to add some more sheeting to these end walls as well as the roof, and I'm using the same 1/2-inch regular plywood sheeting for that. So for the most part, I'd say I'm up here anywhere from 2 to 4 nights a week to work on this. So now, after about a month of that, I'm sitting up here with a fully structurally completed bunkie. There's still a lot of work to go, even just for the exterior, but it's pretty satisfying just to get to this point. Next step on this build is going to be weatherproofing. I have some of these 3-foot rolls of house wrap, and I'm starting at the bottom of the walls and wrapping around the structure, and then lapping the next layer over top with a 3 or 4 inch overlap. I'm just tacking this on with some staples, and then this house wrap will keep everything waterproof until the siding goes on top of here, and be an additional layer of defense against water if it does make it through the siding. And now onto the roof. So I'm going to be putting a metal roof on this tiny cottage, and underneath that roof I need to put some underlay. I'll be using some of the stick down ice and water barrier and sticking it right onto the plywood roofing. And then this itself should pretty much be completely waterproof, and by the time I put the metal roof over top of this, it should be pretty well impervious and last for 50 or more years. God, it's hot. I was just gonna do asphalt shingles on this. It would have been a little bit cheaper, but my main problem here is pine needles. I don't want it to always be covered in needles just for the look of it, and these needles fall like snow all year round. So I'm hoping it should just slide right off the metal roofing since this is a pretty steep slope, and I should never really have to worry about them building up on the roof. But we'll see how that works out. But for now, that's gonna be fully temporarily waterproof, and I'll put the roof on once I have it. We're getting into early to mid-June now, and summer is starting to take full effect in Muskoka. Today the guys are coming to install my big 3-panel front door, so I need to do some work to prepare that. First off, I need to cut out the bottom plate of this wall, so I'm using a multi-tool to cut out both ends and hammer that out. Now I'm going to add some flashing around the opening, so I have this 8-inch flashing tape, and I'm flashing this bottom edge to waterproof that. This is basically a butyl sheet that's put around doors and windows. That way if any water seeps in past the door frame, it won't soak into the wood and cause any rot. I also added some flashing tape up both sides, and I tucked the house wrap in behind this to complete one waterproof seam. And now they're here to install my door. So this cottage is only 107 square feet. I did a lot of brainstorming and design work to come up with ideas to make this space feel bigger than it actually is. And one thing I really wanted was a way to seamlessly mesh this indoor space with the outdoors. I found this company that makes these big 3-panel doors, and not only does this let in a lot of light, but I can actually scissor these all the way open to the one side and seamlessly blend my indoor and outdoor spaces together. Once I have a deck here, I'll be able to walk straight outside without really having any major transition between indoors and out. This door was definitely not cheap, but it's one of the main things I wanted for this bunkie. And this isn't really your run-of-the-mill budget-friendly bunkie. I'm trying more to incorporate everything a cottage has into a small space, so I'm okay with spending some money on some over-the-top features. Thanks to the guys at Favori Doors for coming out to install this, and if you're interested in something like this, you can check out their website. This isn't sponsored, I just genuinely like to help out local businesses. By the way, one of the best things about these builds is just having unlimited firewood around at all times. It's especially nice here because there's not really any infrastructure to do anything else, so it's either have a campfire every night or go into the van and go to bed. So now it's time to start working on the deck. This is the last major structural element that needs to be constructed yet. So for the bulk of the framing, I'm going to be using this pressure treated 2x6 lumber, and I'm cutting a bunch of pieces to size before I take them all over. These are 16-foot lengths, so I found it easier to just cut this with the circular saw rather than trying to rig up the miter saw since it's a little unlevel. So I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing with this part, so I wanted to get a good chunk of the framing here before I start explaining my thought process. The thing that makes this deck really unique is that it's going to blend right into this rock outcropping that sits in front of the bunkie. So the best way I derived to do this was set a board in its final location, but have this sitting up exactly one board width higher. And then using this cutoff piece that has the same width as my joist board, I went along the contours of the rock and traced this cut line onto my board. This gets me a cut line that's pretty close to the exact shape of the rock, and then I can use a jigsaw to cut this out roughly along that line. This takes a bit of trial and error. I definitely wasted a couple boards at the beginning, but once I figured out the technique, this was actually a pretty simple way to trace out that fairly complex live edge. To set my post, I'm once again going to be using a little bit of an unconventional method because of my bedrock situation. Normally the first step of the deck would be to set your posts, but here I found it easier to build the majority of my frame first, and then once I had a location for a post, I'd just dig away that little bit of peat moss and soil that's above the bedrock, and then bring in a cedar 4x4 for the post. So with that sitting on top of the rock, I'd use a marker and just kind of roughly sketch out the contour of the rock and what I need to carve out to make this fit a little better. Then using a sanding wheel and my angle grinder or a saw to cut an angle, I'd carve this out using some trial and error until this hugged the rock a little bit better. Then I can mark my cut line for the top of the deck and cut that with the miter saw before bringing that back and tacking it in place with some decking screws for now. So now that's hugging the rock a little bit better, but what I'm actually going to do here is use some construction adhesive and squeeze this in anywhere I can underneath the post. This isn't to stick it to the rock, this is actually to basically mold it to the rock. This will set up like mortar, and all that adhesive that's between the post and the rock should add more surface area for the wood to connect with the shape of the rock. That's the theory anyway. I don't know why it wouldn't work, but I've never done this before. I'm going to anchor a few of these posts into the ground so that wind never picks up this deck and throws it. So I have these galvanized L brackets and I'm tapping these into the posts with some strong tie screws. And then using a hammer drill, I'm drilling into the bedrock beneath the bracket and using a few tap cons to tap this into the rock. I did this on most of the exterior posts, and this should stop the wind from ever picking this up, since it doesn't have the surface friction of the soil holding the posts in the ground like a normal deck does. Then I continued framing up the last couple pieces of the deck. Now that I have all the posts in place and I know that I'm not making any more changes, I'm going to make a little more of a structural connection here with these big lag screws. I'm putting a couple of these through the 2x6 into each post, and that should hold the weight of the deck long term. And that's the main framing of the deck complete. The next thing I'm going to be doing is an aesthetic touch. I have these cedar 2x8s, and I'm going to be capping around the outside of this framing to make this look like it's all built out of cedar, and it'll also cap in the end of the deck boards I'm about to put on here next. Once I got these set in the right spot, I just tacked them into place with a brad nailer. And then I'd come in from behind with some 2.5-inch screws and fasten this securely. And that keeps a really clean look on the outside with no exposed screw heads. For the decking, I'm using this 6-inch wide cedar deck board and cutting my pieces to length with the miter saw. So to install each piece, I'm using this camo deck screw jig. This clamps around the edges of the board, automatically setting the spacing from the last board, and then I use these special screws, one on each side, and screw them in with the impact. This screws in through the side of the board, and then once the next board is installed, the screws are virtually hidden. I find this just as easy to do as surface screwing, especially since this has a spacer built into it, and the final look is a little more clean than standard surface screws. So once I got to this live edge portion of the deck, I used some trial and error on some scrap pieces to make a cut line that's fairly accurate to the stone. And then I just traced that line onto a fresh board and cut it to length and installed it the same as the others. And that's a finished deck. I'll stain this a little later, but for now it's time to enjoy a nice summer night. And after a night of exploring and campfires, it's time for a good van sleep. So far, I think this is about night 18 or 19 in here.
addition of tiny proportions. Everybody ready?
So the next step for me is going to be the fascia and then the soffit. For the fascia, I'm going to be using real wood, so I have this 1x8 cedar. And I'm first going to be staining this the color that all of my outside wood accents are going to be. And for that, I'm using this Rubio Duro Grit in Rocky Umber color. After a few hours, that's fully dried up, so I can cut my first piece to length with a miter saw. And then I'm taking this up to the roof, starting with this end fascia. I have a cut-off piece of what my soffit material is going to be, so I'm making sure all the overhangs and everything are correct. And then I'll just tack that with a brad nailer for now. Then I have this second piece that I cut one end with the same angle as the roof. I'm getting this into position and then clamping it there, and then I'll mark this cut line before taking the board down and cutting it with a circular saw. This gets my edges to line up almost perfectly, and it's much easier than trying to measure off of weird roof angles. Now this board should be ready for its final fit, so I took it up and aligned everything. And then I'm going to be fastening this permanently with a bunch of 15 gauge nails. And I used some more stain to stain that end cut. And then I just kept working my way around the roof. So now onto the soffit, and for that I'm using these 6-inch wide cedar tongue and groove boards. So I gave all my boards a quick coat of that same stain. And then while that was drying up, I ran my electrical wire through the roof framing that's going to run my outdoor lighting. And now I'm ready to start installing that tongue and groove. I started off at the bottom of the roof and worked my way up one piece at a time. And this tongue and groove is really easy to install. Basically, you nail your piece along the tongue. And then the next piece covers up those nails and repeat. So for a little detail piece at the top, I have this scrap cedar 4x4 that I planed down and stained with the same stain. And I'm going to have this as a beam right at the peak of the roof, so I measured out some screw placement and pre-drilled the holes. And then took this up to install onto that ridge beam. With that installed, I took some similar color caulking and went around the edges all along the roof, sealing in any gaps or cracks so bugs can't get in here, and stained up any dings or remaining cut lines. While I'm working on this, I'm going to install my soffit lighting, so I have these 3-inch gimbal lights, and the gimbal's going to allow me to adjust these lights downwards since these are on a 37-degree slope. So first off, I marked out my light placement, and then I'm using the proper size hole saw to rip through the soffit board. Then I can fish out a length of that electrical wire I left up in here, and then I'm just stripping these wires and connecting them into the light junction box, which I can tuck up inside the soffit and snap my light into place. Oh yeah, one more thing. Just before I started installing the soffit, in my first few boards I drilled a bunch of these holes for roof ventilation. These are going to allow air to be sucked in the soffit and exhausted out the ridge vent once the roof's complete. I'm planning to use rock wool insulation on the inside, so this is a vital part of that system. On the back side of the board, I stapled on this aluminum window mesh to keep bugs out, and now those are just sitting at the bottom of the soffit wide open. So I 3D printed up some of these caps that are going to pop in these holes and give it a more finished professional look. And now that's a completed soffit. Now I'm ready to start installing my windows. I ordered all my windows online from a company called Panes. They have a really good online tool where you can build your windows exactly how you want, and you don't have to deal with any third party where miscommunications happen easily. So the first step of this is cutting out the house wrap around the window opening. I just cut this out exactly flush with the 2x4 framing. And then I cut up this little flap at the top of the window and tape this up out of the way for now. Then I have some of this 6-inch flashing tape, and I'm cutting this maybe 6 inches longer than the width of my window opening. And then with this first piece, I'm sticking it on the front with about half of the width overlapping the opening. And then I'll cut the flashing vertically along the opening and fold the flap over onto the sill. With the second piece, I'll stick this onto the sill, riding up each end, maybe 3 inches. And then fold these flaps around the front edge. This should waterproof the sill, so if any water gets in past the window, it'll flow down to this point, and this won't let it absorb into the wood and cause any rot. Next, I use some 1/2-inch plywood blocking to support the window frame while I nail it in place, and I made sure that's level, and now we're ready for the window. So before I install this, I'm taking some silicone and going around the back side of this nailing fin, giving it a good thick bead of black caulk so that this seals up to the house wrap. The only place I leave a couple gaps is on the bottom of the window, so that if water does flow down to that sill, it can escape out these gaps. So with everything prepped, we can lift the window into place. And then after I make sure everything's level, I'm gonna go around and tack the four corners using some roofing nails. I decided to get windows that have this nailing fin built in to make the install a lot easier. And the brick mold is also cut to allow siding to slide back in here, and I won't have to J-channel around the window later. We then made sure everything was functional with the window and everything's sitting properly one more time. And then I went around nailing off each side with about 4 nails per side. Next, I took some flashing tape and put it up both sides of the window. One thing to keep in mind whenever you're doing exterior work is to always start at the bottom and work your way up. So where I need the sides and the top taped here, I definitely want to do the sides first, and then do the top after that so that water flows from one onto the next without hitting any seams. Then I can bring that house wrap flap back down, and then use some more flashing tape up the sides of that cut. And that's a fully installed and weatherproof window. It took me about a day's work to install these windows, and this is another one of those pretty satisfying tasks because you get to see the view you're going to have from inside for the first time. Oh, we got so close. So now it's time to stain my deck and any other remaining cedar. And for that I'm using that same rocky umber stain I used on the soffit. So I started off applying this with one of these stain applicator pads, but it was pretty hot out today and this stuff seems to dry up pretty quick, so we found it better to just use 2 big stain brushes and work across one board at a time. I'm pretty happy with how this color turned out. It actually matches the pine needles really nicely and makes it look really natural in the landscape. That was actually by complete accident. I just wanted kind of a walnutty color and got this, and I'm pretty happy with it. Now the trim for my roof finally came in, so I can start installing that. First off, I have these drip edge pieces here. And I'm cutting these to size using a pair of aviation snips. With all the bends in these steel pieces, it is a little tough to cut, so you gotta come in with the snips from all angles, and eventually you can work away a pretty clean cut. So these pieces go at the bottom of the roof. When I installed the underlay, I left the backing paper on the bottom maybe 8 inches so that it wouldn't stick down to the plywood. So now I can fold that up and screw the drip edge directly onto the plywood. This needed a couple pieces to complete, so I opened up the seam at the one end and overlapped them by a few inches. And then I can take that backing paper off and stick this down permanently over top of the drip edge so that water flows down. The next pieces are this F trim, and these go at the sides of the roof. So I line this up with the bottom edge of the drip edge and put a couple screws just down near the bottom. But I left this top unscrewed for now, so that it has a bit of wiggle room and I can get up here with some snips and cut all the angles I need right here. Then I can install the second piece of trim and work away at that seam with the snips until I get the two pieces to fit together nicely and have a bit of an overlap so that it sheds water properly. With the backside complete, I started work on the front and did the exact same thing. This end was a little bit more complicated because of that pointed taper up towards the peak, but it's overall the same process. These seams will probably need some caulk to seal them up permanently, but that's a pretty good dry fit. Lastly, I have this starter trim where the roof meets the wall, so I work that around the dormer. And that's the trim done. This is ready to accept the roof panels. So now I have my stand-in seam panels, and I need to cut this first panel with that tapered roof angle. This is probably the most complex piece I have to cut for the whole roof. So I marked out my end measurements and then used a nice straight board to connect them, and marked both sides with a pencil, and scored the one line that's going to be my bend line. Then I use my angle grinder to cut along that cut line. Now I need to bend up the end of this piece so that it sits inside the roof trim. So I used this handbrake and just made small bites and slowly bent this tab upwards until it was at about a 90-degree angle. Now that can seat itself inside the gable trim, and after we make sure it's square, we can start installing the rest of the panels. I had a friend that's a roofer come and camp out for the weekend and help me out with this roofing because I'm kind of afraid of heights and really didn't want to do this myself. He also loves the outdoors, so it was a good summer camping weekend for both of us. So on the bottom of each of my panels, I have to prepare it for the roof before it goes up. So I first cut back this rib and bent over a tab. And then I can trace this line and cut it out so that I can bend this over to cap the end of the rib. On the other side, I need to cut about 1.5 inches of this snap lock off. And then with that remaining flap at the end of the sheet, I use a handbrake to bend that around backwards so that it clips onto the drip edge. Then these sheets just snap together and get screwed in with some pancake head screws. And the following sheet always covers up the screws of the last one, so there's really nowhere this roof can leak. Finally, we installed the ridge cap, and that's the roof complete. So up until this point, I've actually just been able to use a solar panel and the van power bank to charge up all my tool batteries. But now I need to use a table saw, so I'm going to have to get out my generator. So I'm cutting up this cedar 2x6 into some 1.5" wide sections, or basically just making a bunch of cedar 2x2s. This is going to make some trim for the front of the building before I move on to stonework. Then I gave these a quick sand with some 80 grit sandpaper, and then I have this black outdoor paint. This is a semi-gloss sheen, so it should match the black of the windows and any of my other black trim. So I gave my 2x2s a couple coats of this paint until they had an even coverage. So first of all, around the door, I'm installing this trim to basically be a brick mold. There's going to be a stone veneer on this wall that's going to stick out probably an inch or an inch and a quarter out from where the wall is right now. So I need some sort of molding around the door to cap that in. That finishes off the door, and I got my windows pre-ordered with that 1.5" brick mold, so I don't have to do anything to them. While I was here, I still have some of that flashing tape sticking out beneath the door, which is ugly and off color. So I ripped up another thin strip of this cedar and nailed it on, and then I'll stain this the same color as the deck and all the other wood accents. So my stone front is only going to wrap around the corner and then end, so I measured back about a foot from the front wall and made a level line up to the roof. And then I nailed on another piece of that brick mold cedar. Lastly, I have to trim around the bottom and top edges, so I have some of this black steel drip edge. And I'm cutting this up with some aviation snips to nail this into the wall and cap in the bottom edge between those two brick mold boards. Then I have a piece of this bug screen, and this is going to get glued right on top of this trim. This is going to allow ventilation in behind the stone veneer, while stopping any bugs from climbing up into the air barrier that I'm about to put on next. This is supposed to go along any of the bottom horizontal surfaces, so I also had to put a strip of this on top of the door. And lastly, I used some of this 2-inch angle flashing to cap in the top of the wall so that I'm not getting any mortar directly onto the soffit itself. And now I'm ready to install the air barrier and lath. So I'm going to be using an all-in-one product for that. I have this Delta dry and lath. This has two sides. The outward side has this fiberglass lath that'll accept a mortar scratch coat. And the inside has this dimpled plastic that'll allow airflow up in behind the stone wall. That'll allow moisture to escape and not seep into the wood and cause any future problems or rotting. So that's basically the purpose of an air barrier. To install this is pretty simple. I have a bunch of these 2-inch stainless steel screws and some stainless fender washers. And I'd just cut a piece of this dry and lath to size and fit it onto my wall, and then screw it into the studs using these screws and washers. This is what's going to be holding the weight of the stone to the structure, so you want to use a lot of these screws. I put one of these about every 6 inches down every stud. The more the better. This is going to be holding quite a bit of weight, so you don't want it to fail at any time. This is another one of those things that I've never done before, but once you spend enough time building stuff, you realize that the process to do a lot of tasks is really similar, just with some minor tweaks. You're basically thinking about where is water going to drain, how is airflow going to work, and how is the weight of whatever you're installing going to be supported by the structure. Oh yeah, and watching tons of YouTube videos to figure out your next step. That's basically my nightly routine. Next, I'm ready to start the scratch coat. So I'm going to be mixing up a Type S masonry mix. So I have this Type S Portland cement and some bags of brick sand. My hardware store didn't have any brick sand, so this play sand is pretty much the exact same thing. So I'm going to mix this up in a concrete mixer with about 3 parts sand to 1 part Portland cement, and about a half part water to start. I'll start mixing that, adding water until I get it to this workable kind of peanut butter consistency. And now this is ready to spread over the lath. So I'd take a couple scoops of mortar and put it on this mortar hawk. And then I can hold this up to the wall and trowel some mortar off, working it into that lath. I'm basically trying to get the mortar to fill the space behind the lath completely, and then cover up the fiberglass by a few millimeters. This turned out to be a pretty messy job, so before I went any further, I plasticed off all the windows and anything that can't get dirty, and then started working my way across the wall. This was a pretty quick process, but it's still unbelievably hot. This summer we've had like 20 or 30 days that have been 35 or higher and 100% humidity. So what better way to cool down than a quick blowjob from your girlfriend? So once I had all that mortar pressed into place and it's hardened up for maybe an hour or so, I'm taking a couple of spare nails and making scratch lines into the mortar every inch or so. The purpose of this is to add some texture to the mortar before it dries, so that when we stick our stone veneer on top of this, it has all these little grooves and scratches to bond to, rather than trying to stick onto a smooth mortar face. And now we'll let that cure up for a couple days. So on top of the scratch coat, I'm going to be installing this limestone veneer. These are basically pieces of stone that they've sawn the face off of so that they're about 3/4 of an inch or an inch thick. On top of those flat pieces, I also have a bunch of these corners, which is basically the exact same thing. It just has a 90-degree angle cut into it and a natural outside corner. I'll be sticking this onto the wall using some Mason Bond 400, which is a polymer modified mortar specifically designed to stick on these heavy stone veneers. So with that mixed up to, again, a sort of peanut buttery consistency, I sprayed the back of the stone with some water, and then used a trowel to apply about a 1/4 to 3/8 inch thick coat of mortar. Then over on the wall, I'd spray the scratch coat with water to moisten it, and use some twigs as spacers before sticking that stone right onto the wall. This Mason Bond mortar hugs onto the scratch coat pretty nicely, and as long as you work from the bottom up to keep them from sagging, these are going to suction themselves right onto the wall and cure up in a couple hours. Once I was done the corner pieces, I moved on to the flats to fill in the gaps. These get installed the exact same way, wetting down both the stone and the scratch coat, and then applying some mortar to the back of the stone and sticking it on the wall. Once it was stuck on, I'd clean off anything that squeezed out from behind the stone just with my finger quickly. And then I just worked around the wall, filling in the gaps. Since this is a random pattern, I don't have to do much cutting. For most of these smaller pieces, I'd just take a larger stone and hit it with a hammer, breaking it up into a bunch of small random pieces. And then I'd work around with those to find something that fits whatever gap I'm trying to fill. There was still obviously some cuts that need to be made though, and for those I'd try to find a piece that's pretty close that just needs an edge cut off of it. And then I used my cheap electric concrete saw to make that cut pretty quickly and easily. The saw is powered by the generator, and the water pump I powered from my van power bank, and that made the cuts pretty quick and easy and dust-free. Now with all the stones stuck on there, it's time to add the grout and finish this off. I'm mixing up the grout the same as I've mixed up all my other concrete products, and this time I'm mixing it to more of a pudding consistency. Then I have one of these grout bags. This is like a heavy-duty version of an icing bag you'd use to decorate a cake, just for less tasty mortar. Not completely untasty, just less tasty. So I filled a couple scoops into the bag, and then you can just squeeze it to apply beads of grout. This makes grouting pretty easy. I can just go along the stones, filling in the gap between each of them. I'm going to overfill a little bit right now, and it's not going to be too pretty, but in a couple hours I'm going to come back and smooth this all out once it hardens up a bit. So after an hour or two, that grout's fingerprint hard, meaning I can still press into it and it's kind of soft, but it's no longer goopy or messy. So now, using my finger, I'm just going to go along the grout, pressing it into the joint. I'm just trying to squeeze this into all the voids of the joint while scraping off any of the excess and smoothing it out. This goes pretty quick and it's pretty satisfying. It's kind of like sculpting the joint. Once I had an area pressed in and kind of roughly shaped, I'd go back with a brush and brush along the joint, and that gives everything a nice clean final finish. When I was installing this grout, I also put some of these wood spacers along the bottom edge that I can pull out now, and these reach back to that bug screen we installed earlier and act as weep holes for water drainage. And with that grout fully done, the next day I can come back and cut away all the masking and plastic to reveal the finished front wall of my bunkie for the first time. I've never done a stone veneer like this, but I'm really happy with how it turned out. It's really natural looking, which is perfect for this build, but still timeless and elegant. So we're coming up on the end of August now, and autumn is starting to show its first signs in the woods. My next step is going to be the siding for the dormer, and for that I have this cedar shake shingle. And before I install these, I'm staining them each individually with that rocky umber stain to match the rest of the wood accents. So after that's dried up for a couple hours, I can start installing this on my dormer. I'm using this 1/2-inch chunk of plywood to keep these all spaced evenly off the roof, and I'm tacking these in place for now using a brad nailer. I'm just keeping about an 1/8 of an inch gap between each piece so that there's the proper airflow and drainage, and working my way across the first layer. Once I had a layer installed and everything seemed okay with it, I came back with some 1.5-inch nails and nailed these in place more permanently. All these shingles are going to have an overlap, so just be conscious of that while you're nailing, and you can hide pretty much all of these nails. The first layer is actually a double layer, so I went back around and covered up every shingle again, making sure the gap between shingles isn't in the same place so it sheds water properly. And then I can start working my way up the wall. Once I needed to start a new layer, I measured out my spacing from the soffit, and then used a level to complete that line across the dormer. Once I got to a corner, I can set the shake in place, and then I'm going to trace the cut line along the back edge, and cut this out with a jigsaw. Then I can set the piece in place and nail it on, and use a little bit more stain to seal up that cut edge. On the next layer, I'd make sure my seam is the opposite way, meaning the cut edge would be on the front this time instead of the side, and that technique is called weaving a corner. This dormer really wasn't much surface area, but it actually took me about 1.5 days to side this, just because of the complexity and getting up on ladders and whatever else. You know, just normal construction delays. A half day turns into 1.5 days almost every day. But it looks pretty nice in the end. So we're getting into the last couple steps of the exterior of my little cottage here. The next thing I want to do is add these windowsill beams underneath a couple of the windows. So I have these big cedar 6x6s. I decided these stick out a little bit too far from the wall, so I'm actually going to narrow this about 1 inch or so. And to do that, I'll be using a planer powered by the generator. So I'm making multiple passes with the planer, taking off about 1/16 of an inch each time, until I take that thickness down about 1 inch or so. Now I need to measure and cut these beams to length, So I marked this out with a tape measure and square and cut 3 of the sides with a circular saw. Then I just finished that cut up with the handsaw. One more thing is I made a bunch of shallow cuts along the back side of the beam with the circular saw, so that once this is screwed up against the wall, if water gets in behind the siding and onto the house wrap, that water can drain down through the beam through these cuts rather than absorbing into the wood. After giving these a sand with some 80 grit, I took them inside to give them a coat of that rocky umber stain since it started trickling rain outside. Like most of this build, I'm doing this by myself, so I'm going to be using these brackets I had made up earlier to support the beam while I screw it in. And then I'm going to tack this in place from the inside using some screws through the plywood. And to mount these permanently, I'm going to be using these 8-inch lag screws. I screwed these in through the studs with about 4 of them holding this beam, and that should hold this forever. With the first sill installed, I can install the second one that spans across both of these side windows. And that's the second last step of the exterior complete, now just the siding. So we're coming up on Labor Day weekend here, and that's another summer in the books. Overall, I'm really happy with what I accomplished this summer. I got to spend a lot of time in nature, and I've built this entire structure from scratch so far. It really connects you with what's important being outdoors like this, especially for long periods of time like I've been out here. Seeing the seasons change from spring to summer is exciting and full of growth and energy, and I'll be watching it change to fall and winter as I work on the interior in the coming months. So for the last step, I'm going to be putting on this dark gray vinyl siding. So I have to start off with the trim, and first I have one of these outside corner posts, and I'm cutting that to size using some snips. And to install this onto the building, I first snapped a chalk line about 2 1/4 inches off the corner. And that way when I hold up this corner post, I can use this chalk line to make sure all my nails go down that same line. I'm using some 1 1/4 roofing nails to secure this to the wall, hammering a nail every foot or so down the line. And one really important thing with vinyl siding is you don't want to nail this tight. You actually leave a bit of a gap so that the siding can move underneath this and allow for contraction and expansion with the seasons. The trim I'm going to be using for pretty much everywhere else is this J channel. So first, this goes along the bottom edge of a wall, so I snapped a chalk line for the same reasons as before. And then nailed in the J-channel every foot or so along that line. These bottom J-channels also need some weep holes to allow water to escape, so I drilled some 1/8 inch holes about every 16 inches. And that way when water runs down this finished siding wall, it'll collect down in the J-channel and be able to drain out these weep holes. Some J-channel also goes along the top edges of the wall, along the soffit. Along the side edges of a wall that don't meet up in a corner post, like this stone edge. And around anything in the wall, like those beams. You'd also have to do around the windows, but my windows have a built-in J-channel, so I don't have to trim them. There's a certain way to cut this and make it all fit together, as well as shed water properly. But there's hundreds of videos on YouTube that show you specifically how to install this J-channel, so I'll leave that to those videos. The last trim I need is this starter trim or sill trim, and the purpose of this is to hold a cut edge of siding in place so it's not flopping around in the J-channel loose. Since I'll be installing vertical board and batten siding, this trim will get installed along any of the vertical edges. Which means inside of these corner posts, inside this J-channel at the edge of the wall, and along the vertical sides of any of the windows. Basically, any vertical edge that's longer than about a foot needs this trim. So now with my actual siding pieces, I can measure this to length. And cut it out with some snips. One thing to note with vinyl siding is you do have to leave quite a bit of room for expansion. So when I measure my wall from the top of the top J-channel to the bottom of the bottom J-channel, I subtracted about a 3/4 inch off of this measurement to give me my panel length. On the starter piece, I also have to rip this to width. So I used a fresh sheet of siding for a straight edge and ripped that with the snips. So now this piece slips inside the starter trim. And after I make sure that's square with the end of the wall, I can start installing my siding panels. Again, I'm nailing these in with a roofing nail about every 16 inches down the nailing strip. And I'm leaving these pretty loose so that the siding can move up and down as the weather makes it expand and contract. Around any windows or other obstructions, I just make the measurements as I get to the cut piece and cut my openings as needed with the snips. Again, you don't want to cut these pieces super tight. I'd leave about a 1/2 inch gap around the windows so that this piece could still move freely. And for the next couple days, I just spent my time working my way around the building. And with that finished, the outside of my little cottage is finally complete. It took me about 3 months working, eating, and sleeping in the outdoors to get to this point, but this has honestly been one of the most fun and fulfilling experiences of my life, and I'll be able to enjoy this for many years to come. About 1.5 years ago, I pulled the trigger on buying this property, and I'm so happy that I did. Being surrounded 24/7 by the outdoors and building something with your hands is a really fulfilling journey. I spent about 35 nights camping out in my van this summer to get to this point, and I'm really happy with how my little cottage has turned out so far. Its blend of natural materials and contemporary style fits into the landscape perfectly, and that's something I hope to continue as I work on the inside coming into the fall and winter. But for now, it's time to appreciate what I've accomplished here and enjoy the end of summer. I hope you enjoyed watching this video half as much as I enjoyed making it. And if you want to see how this little cottage and all the other builds I have planned out for this property turn out in the future, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. To construct the entire outside, I'm at about $35,000 Canadian, which is right in line with my roughly $50,000 budget for the finished product. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.